Hello and welcome. I am Freddie Edelman. I'm the director of Smithsonian Associates here in Washington, D.C. We offer educational programs that are inspired by and amplify everything that the Smithsonian has to offer. I'd be glad to welcome all of you to join us sometime soon. You can find us at smithsonianassociates.org. But until then, I hope that just like me, you've been enjoying everything about the Smithsonian National Education Summit sessions. They've been inspiring, and I know that there's going to be some terrific discourse this afternoon. It is my pleasure today to extend a warm Smithsonian welcome to the inspiring panelists for this session, The Perfect Primary Source Combination. Our panelists come to us from the Library of Congress and include 4 project leads from across the country who've been combining primary source collections to engage educators. These exemplary leaders are from the Minnesota Historical Society, Mars Hill University, the Emerging America Program at the Collaborative for Educational Services, and the California History Social Science Project at UC Davis. They will share how they use primary sources from a range of online repositories to create new learning opportunities that until now were never before possible. Our moderator for today's session is Leanne Potter. She is the Director of Educational Outreach at the Library of Congress and is joined here by Jessica Ellison, Dr. Bridget Morton, Allison Noyes, and Dr. Tuyen Tran. Throughout the session, they'll share their expertise and insights. They've got some opportunities for you to learn more about the Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium and the grant program. Please welcome our panelists, and Leanne, over to you.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. And Freddie, thank you so much. And a big shout out and thank you to our colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution for welcoming their Library of Congress colleagues to participate in this National Education Summit. When my supervisor, Sherry Werb, who used to work at the Smithsonian, met with Monique and with Ashley to tell them a little bit more about our Teaching with Primary Sources program. Their enthusiasm was fantastic, and they graciously welcomed us to be a part of the summit. And just again, thank you very much. And also a big thank you to many of our Teaching with Primary Sources partners all across the country who literally answered the call when my colleague Vivian Awume, our TPS project manager, sent an email out to all of them a couple of months ago saying, hey, we know that many of you utilize resources from institutions in addition to the Library of Congress in the work that you do with teachers and students. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do now? Because we had like a 24-hour deadline. And I can't say enough about literally the dozens of organizations across the country who have received Teaching with Primary Sources grants from the library, who responded and told us about the amazing work that they are doing. And when I say amazing, I think that's exactly what you're going to get a glimpse of in the next hour and 30 minutes from our colleagues on this panel, because they represent 4 of those dozens of organizations and present a terrific sampling of the kind of work that is happening across the country, where primary sources play a starring role. And with that, now I can see my big screen and I see all my friends. So welcome Allison and Bridget and Jessica and Tuyen, and especially Tuyen for getting up early this morning on the West Coast. And I hope you get breakfast at some point. Very good. I think we're ready to sort of start advancing our slides, because for those of you who are familiar with the library and with our Teaching with Primary Sources program, you know that we always like to begin our programming by actually engaging in some document analysis. So let's see. Khalid, go ahead. Yeah, perfect. All right. So I'm hopeful that all of you are seeing on your screen a photograph. It is a black and white photograph. And I'm not going to say anything else about that because I want you guys to do that. I'd like you to spend a little bit of time focusing your attention on the photograph you see on the screen. And as we do with all of our primary source analysis activities, just observe and then spend a little time reflecting on those observations, and then start considering questions that you have about the image. And I know that on your screens, what you have access to is something that says if you have questions, but it's okay if you go ahead and use the "do you have a question" box and start typing in your observations and your reflections and your questions. And our colleague Camille from the Smithsonian will make sure that we know what kinds of things you guys are noticing and questioning. This is that wait time that's so awkward, and it's even worse in the virtual environment. Yeah, literally, you're fine. We're just giving a little wait time so folks can focus their attention on that photograph. So I think, let's see, Khalid, if you could put the photograph back up. I don't know if our participants are seeing the photograph. There we go, perfect. Yeah, they don't need to see us. They need to see that. Yeah. All right. So participants, go ahead and type into your box where you can ask questions what you are noticing about this photograph. And if we don't hear from some of you soon, I'm going to start picking on Allison and Jessica and Tuyen. Good. Okay, I observe a large group of well-dressed white men. Most are standing. One is sitting with a device in front of him, wondering if this is a new invention or if an important announcement is being made. Someone else notices the man sitting at a table with a lot of people around him. Lots of suits and mustaches, yes. Something unusual. Okay, this is good. These are great. Jessica or Tuyen, Allison, if you want to chime in. Fancy room, good. Paneling, okay, excellent. Oh, this is good. Somebody's projecting an idea about maybe this is Bell using the telephone to announce something. This is good. You guys are good guessers. I love it. Listening attentively, nice. Okay. Yeah, this is great. Jessica wants to know when and where this is taking place. Good. Mustaches. Maybe prior to World War I. Official occasion, staged photograph rather than authentic moment. Oh, this is all good. All right. Okay, what if I were to tell you that this photograph, I'm not going to tell you everything about it, just a little bit. If I told you that this photograph comes from the Library of Congress and it forms part of the Gilbert Grosvenor collection of photographs of the Alexander Graham Bell family, and it was taken on October 18th, 1892. Does anything change about what you're observing or what you're wondering or what you're tempted to do, but you won't because you're in a workshop right now? I love it. I love it. Somebody is commenting on the shape of the device in front of Alexander Graham Bell, thinking it resembles the Loch Ness Monster. I love this. Fabulous. Fabulous. Oh, I know, Jessica, you're right, but don't be tempted. Well, go ahead. If you really are tempted to start doing your research, I can't, well, I can prevent you, Jessica. I can't prevent participants. Yeah, this is great. Oh, interesting. Somebody wants to know if it's the first transatlantic call. Nice. This is good. Any other things you're wondering about? Okay. Somebody's wondering maybe it's at the World's Fair. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, thank you guys for chiming in a little bit. And I hope that even if you haven't typed something into the chat or into the question area, that you really are wondering a little bit about the image. And the reason we wanted to share this image with you was, again, just to sort of get your thinking caps on about photograph or, primary source analysis, but also to get you thinking about the questions. And now I'm going to ask you a question that's a little bit different. And that is, if you really wanted to find answers to the questions that you have, and you think about the different kinds of primary sources that exist that might enable you to answer those questions, what types of sources would you go looking for? And what types of repositories would you focus your attention on? Again, if you want to type into the chat, that would be terrific. What sources would you go? Like, let's just say you were wondering, who are those people in addition to, is that in fact Alexander Graham Bell sitting at the table? And if it is, who are all those other people in the room? And where might you go to find out who those other people are? And if this event that happened on October 18th, 1892 was significant, what kind of resource might you go to find, say a news story about the event? And then based on information you might find in that story, where else might you go? And what other kinds of sources might you look for? Yeah, this is good. Somebody wonders, are there archives that let you look up who's with other individuals in photos? Yeah, like what other bibliographic information exists? Great. Somebody knows about Chronicling America. Yay. Good. I'm going to tell you, this is where you have to wait till the end of our presentation, because I'm going to tell you about something very cool that is in fact in Chronicling America about this. Very good. Very good. Yeah, awesome. Somebody else knows about the Alexander Graham Bell papers. Excellent. And good. Somebody's suggesting you could go to different libraries, different archives, museums on the internet. You could go to university sites. Yeah, somebody's mentioned Alexander Graham Bell collections. And, there are Bell collections, not just the Library of Congress, but elsewhere, including the Smithsonian, including a museum dedicated to Alexander Graham Bell in Nova Scotia. Okay. Yeah, good. This is all good. Excellent. Well, that's sort of very closely related to how this panel came about. What we are hoping to do today is share with you a variety of projects that are being supported through Teaching with Primary Sources grants from the Library of Congress, but also feature materials from different repositories, including the Smithsonian, including the National Archives, including local historical societies and archival collections. And my panelists, who you met sort of a minute ago when you saw everybody on the screen and Freddie introduced them, but they're going to be telling you stories about their projects. I tell you what, Khalid, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. And this is one more opportunity. I'm going to ask my panelists this question, but before I do, I'd like it if every participant on this program thinks about it just a little bit. When you are working, again, and I'm making a lot of assumptions about your familiarity with primary sources, but of course, primary sources are the raw materials of history. These are the photographs, the architectural drawings, the manuscripts, the journals, the sound recordings, the documentation of events that happened at the time that the event that you're studying, the time they were created, the time the event happened. These are materials created at the time that the event under study, happened. And when we're thinking about how can we engage young people in primary source analysis and in original research, it's important for us to consider the different kinds of combinations that help us solve the questions that come to our minds. And so if everybody on the call would just sort of think about it from what makes the perfect primary source connection or combination rather, that's where we're going to start our conversation with our panelists. And one thing that I failed to do early in this conversation, and I was asked to do this by our Smithsonian colleagues, and so I'm going to ask my panelists to do it as well, and that is describe our own settings. So again, I'm Leanne, and I work for the Library of Congress, but today I'm actually at my home in Maryland, and I'm wearing a blue jacket and a white blouse, and behind me is a very packed bookshelf. I tend to collect books, and that's evidence. And again, I'm going to call out to my colleagues. So Bridget, maybe you could start. Or actually, I tell you what, Jessica, I believe you are starting first. Sorry, I'm remembering my order of slides. And Khalid, you can go ahead and go to the next one. And Jessica, jump right in. What makes the perfect primary source combination?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Ellison. I'm calling in from the homeland of the Mdewakanton Dakota in Minnesota, just north of St. Paul. And I am a early 40s white woman wearing a sleeveless blue dress. And I'm in my room with a bank of windows along one wall and yellow walls behind me. And I work at the Minnesota Historical Society, but the work that we do really focuses on culturally relevant pedagogy, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But the big question for us is how can learners see themselves in primary sources and then develop critical consciousness? And so I like to think about what do we have in common that we can start with, and then how do we expand to others' experiences? So the question with these sources is how do we contextualize COVID for students, because all students have an experience with the COVID pandemic, all Americans, all humans, right? But those experiences are very different because of everyone's different life situations. So then how do we make connections between the COVID pandemic, past pandemics and epidemics, and students or learners' individual stories? Because to be culturally relevant, it really relies on integrating these diverse experiences. So using primary sources can be these powerful tools to reflect experiences. So when I went looking for sources about that, the Library of Congress has these, I'm going to start on the right and move the other way, has these incredible posters from Amplifier that reflect what was happening in 2020 with different communities and COVID. And so there's this beautiful poster of Indigenous community in the Dakotas talking about stay home. And it has an imagery that reflects ledger art and has the little COVID, what are those called? The little COVID virus things. I'm a historian here, not a scientist. But it reflects the experiences of the community. But then I thought, what would be really helpful is to see how we can connect these experiences through the past. And so I went to the National Library of Medicine because of the content expertise. Library of Congress has incredible materials. I went and found a polio poster in Spanish so that we could reflect on Spanish-speaking communities and say this was an experience for groups as well. And then I thought, the library doesn't have a lot of objects, and students love objects. They love to see the stuff and the materials and what is that made of? And so I found this incredible resource from the smallpox epidemics and pandemics. It is, in fact, a scab carrier. So before there were vaccines, this is how you inoculated someone, is you would take around the scabs of infected people and you would inoculate people. And anyone who's ever taught elementary students will know that the gross out factor will reel them in, and then you can talk about how pandemics and epidemics affected different communities differently.
Oh, awesome, Jessica. Shout out to the Smithsonian for having objects that capture attention, certainly. And I liked what you described about the perfect primary source combinations being objects that are relevant to our audiences. Really great. All right. So next, how about our next panelist? Jump right in, and Tuyen, you can share with us some of your thoughts on what makes the perfect primary source combination.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tuyen, and I am tuning in from UC Davis, home of the Patwin folks, who were the indigenous folks here in the area. I am Chinese and Vietnamese descent, and so I have the best jet black, straight, silky hair you've ever seen or could imagine. And I'm solidly middle-aged. So that's my background and my setting. For the perfect primary source, if I could, forward here, you'll see here that what I started out with, and I'm going to continue to speak about this set of primary sources and sort of this project I'm working on. And for May is Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And every May, folks, turn out the AAPI sort of resources. And this year I wanted to, because I am Chinese Vietnamese, it's not just May, but it's AAPI month, life, 24/7 all the time. I did want to sort of share out biographies that I felt like was difficult to find on the web, which is odd because biographies are everywhere, but biographies that are attuned to use in the classroom for teachers and students that sort of couple a narrative about that historical figure or that figure's life, couples that with primary sources, is actually not something that you see quite often. And so that's a project I've been working on. And as you can see here, I have a variety of sources that I wanted to put together to show how folks could be commemorated, and also thinking about how folks want to be represented by their own community, and then how they become memorialized by the nation. So you'll see here, I have a stamp of Duke Kanana Moku, a famous surfer from Hawaii. I also have from Chronicling America, which is a digital archive where you can look up all sorts of wonderful newspapers from way back when and put in all sorts of fun features, search features, and pull up all sorts of fun things as a result. But I have a picture here of Mabel Lee. You'll see who was the first woman who walked in a parade advertising or as a Chinese suffragist at the age of 15 or 16. And that's her picture, and there's a whole article about her and how significant she was, and how aspiring she was for the local folks there. And then I have I have two screenshots of an interview with an author of a children's book, and that's Larry Itliong in the lower middle. And he was a labor activist that helped spearhead the largest labor strike in the United States that would popularize Cesar Chavez. But the unknown story is that Filipinos were the first to strike during the Grape Strike. And then there became a solidarity movement, and Larry Itliong was an essential player in that. And so for the biography, this is not a primary source of Larry Itliong's life. It's a cartoon of his story, a children's book of his story. But I wanted to talk about like commemoration, like how people are remembered, the stories that are important to the people the people that they've affected, and sort of their legacy as told by the community. And then finally, I have a picture of Filipino farm workers in Southern California that was taken by Dorothy Lang as a way to sort of picture the stark sort of conditions in which people worked. And then I would normally have students look through that and process it in the same way that Leanne just did with us with our opener. So a perfect primary source set to me is one that sparks curiosity and motivation to learn more.
Oh, I love it. And I also, it's fun, Tuyen, as you're describing these objects, it's very clear that you're keeping in mind perspective, and you're also thinking about just the variety of media that primary sources come in. So I think we're building a really nice answer to this question about what makes the perfect primary source collection or combination when we're focused on instructional goals. Bridget, tell us about what makes a perfect primary source combination for you.
Great. So I'm coming to you guys from Mars Hill, North Carolina. That's in the western part of the state, located in the Appalachian Mountain region, which is part of what builds my project. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the things that our project has focused on for the past several years is exploring the diversity within the region of Appalachia. Mars Hill itself is very homogeneous. I forgot to describe my background. Sorry. I'm in my classroom at Mars Hill University, and I'm a white middle-aged woman wearing a green shirt. But we are located in a very homogeneous area. And probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we started trying to debunk some of the myths about Appalachia being a very white place. And that started with kind of one of our first projects that began delving into slavery within the mountains of Western North Carolina. And this has led us to our bigger project of diversity as a whole within the region. And so for me, typically a primary source set begins with an image that students can really connect to and respond to and begin talking about, much like Leanne did with us at the beginning of this session. But what we have found is that music is a great entry point with students as we talk about diversity within this region. So the primary source set that I have in front of you begins with musical recordings, and the links to some of those are at the bottom from the Library of Congress, from Smithsonian, and then from our own collection here on campus, the Bascom Lamar Lunsford collection in our digital archives here. But we begin with these songs and have students listen for instrumental sounds that they recognize, and then also listen to the lyrics and take note of lyrics that are interesting to them, either because they are very familiar, the objects and items and places that are being talked about are familiar, or they seem very strange and not things that are a part of what our students are used to experiencing now. So looking at familiarity and things that seem a little foreign to them. And then this set moves from there into what you see in front of you, some of the instruments themselves. And again, students love objects. So another object that I pull into this primary source set that we have in our archives here on campus are the Gourd Banjos that were built by the indigenous tribes that lived in our area. And so that's fun for them to touch and look at in person when they're able to be here with us. But we also have these great musical instruments, the images of those that were pulled from the Smithsonian resources. So the physical instruments, the photographs of various types of people playing these instruments, and then also some of the manuscripts of the lyrics that allow students to do a deeper dive into the language that is used within the songs. And one thing you can see here on my slide is that we're looking, this is just a sampling, but the different places that these instruments and sounds came to Appalachia from. So where did these individuals immigrate to our space from? And how has the collision of those cultures created what we now call Appalachian culture? So we have some examples here from the British Isles, from Germany and West Africa, just as a sampling. And so for me, this primary source set is an example of using whatever your first source is as an entry point to intrigue students to have conversations. And once the conversations with students begin around a topic, then the primary source set, the teachers can bring in additional primary sources that provide support that allow students to dig deeper into their questions and that provide that link to the primary content or theme that is being reviewed or discussed within the unit that teachers are presenting. Thank you, and I will pass it on to Allison.
Thanks so much, Bridget. I do want to comment on just the description you provided. I think your ability to identify a variety of primary sources in terms of sort of their sensory motivation is really neat. I think incorporating music and so many tactile objects sort of, again, adds to what is it that makes a great or a perfect primary source combination. And you also mentioned just geographic diversity of the materials that you are featuring. All right, Allison, bring us home. By the end of this, we're going to have like the perfect definition of the perfect combination, what it takes. What have you got?
Well, I'm delighted to be here. My name's Allison Noyes. I represent the Collaborative for Educational Services, and we are located in Western Massachusetts in Nipmuc unceded territory and ancestral land. And we serve a national group of teachers as well as local teachers in our area. From our perspective, the perfect primary source combination combines items that appeal to different senses and ways of processing information. If you look at this source set, which has an ADA button from the Smithsonian, a photograph of a George Bush the first signing ceremony from the White House, civil rights leader Jesse Jackson photo with disability advocate from the Library of Congress, a poster from the Disability History Museum showing a child looking through gates at a schoolyard, which is inaccessible. These items can appeal to different senses. You can imagine the button and pinning it on yourself. They're tangible, visual. As Bridget so vividly described, great collections have auditory, motion, and ability sometimes to actually touch sources. Also, items that connect the past to the present. That poster can really draw in participants of all ages, but particularly young participants, to think about the time at which disabilities prevented children from being in school and think about what it means to be excluded. And notably, the other thing that perfect collections of primary sources are to give a collection that gives choice and agency to the participants you're working with so that they can gravitate towards the source that's most meaningful for them. And that will be different in every group and within every group. So a perfect primary source is often several primary sources, and we find those sources in several places as we're trying to meet the particular needs of the group we expect to have with us. So with that, I'll pass it back to Leanne.
Yeah, that was great, Allison. You really wrapped us up beautifully. Really, the point of this little exercise, getting us thinking about the perfect combinations of primary sources, really is intended to get every participant thinking in this way and learning a little bit more about programs and projects that are supported by the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources program. And by describing your perfect combinations, you've done a great job of enticing us to want to know more about your projects. So that's what we're going to do next. So let's see, Khalid, you can advance to the next slide. And with this one, this is our question. And Jessica's going to start us out, and that is just tell us a little bit more about your project.
Thanks, Leanne. So our project is called Inquiry in the Upper Midwest, and we have been a TPS partner since 2016. And the focus of our project is culturally relevant pedagogy with primary sources. And it's evolved over the past 6 years. We have created videos and webinars and primary source sets on our website and delivered workshops, institutes. I have one next week for 60 teachers coming from all over Minnesota and Wisconsin. But the primary focus is CRP, and CRP is a teaching framework developed by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. And the primary focus of CRP is it's learner-centered. It focuses on students choosing academic success, developing their cultural competence, and examining and critiquing the status quo. And so in order to do that work well, we have to consider the varied experiences of our audience, which includes not only the students, but also the teachers. And where are the teachers coming from? Urban, rural, suburban areas, areas that are homogenous in population or diverse. And that's what I loved about hearing from my colleagues here, doing really good CRP work. It means that you have to focus on who are you serving and what are their different experiences, whether it's experiences of different ethnicities and culture, of geography, or of different abilities and disabilities. And so in order to do this well, we have to look at various repositories because every student comes to us and every teacher comes to us with a different set of life experiences. So certainly the Library of Congress has incredible resources that they're always updating that we use quite a bit. In particular, I love the Sanborn fire insurance maps in the library's collection because there is nothing more relevant to a student than their time and place. And so if you can make connection to where that student lives, you've got them. But we also use the Smithsonian. Like I said, using objects is really valuable for students to be able to see themselves in their experiences and to learn about their classmates. But we also use the National Archives. Certainly the Minnesota Historical Society has a large collection of objects and 2D materials, and things like the Digital Public Library of America. When I look for resources to reflect the audience that I'm teaching, I start with the library and then I branch out. How else can I build this nuanced set of instructional materials that teachers can then use and say, I see myself and I see how I can modify this for my students because students change every year. The students that the teachers are teaching, and then the students themselves. Oftentimes we'll say the kid that comes to you in September, not the same kid that leaves you in June. And so teachers have to be flexible and be able to understand how to build these sources. And so we have a bunch of materials to help teachers with that process.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. And Gwen, you want to add on to that, telling us about your project?
You didn't have to say it. I unmuted myself. Yes, so I am with the California History Social Science Project. If we could advance the slide, that would be great. So we are a statewide network, and I work for the statewide office, which is headquartered at UC Davis, not to be confused with our local site as well. That is also administered by its own director. So we have a local site that serves local teachers in the area of Sacramento and Davis, the Davis History Project. I work for the statewide office. We also have offices at UC Davis, Santa Cruz, UCLA, and Irvine. And most of our regional sites are headquartered in history departments and have an affinity and relationship with history departments. Because we are a K-16 collaborative, we work with historians, scholars, teacher leaders, and history education folks to provide the highest quality history education possible. And that means providing professional learning experiences, creating instructional resources, and teacher leadership development. We've been part of the TPS Consortium since 2009, and it's been a beautiful marriage because one of the key sort of focus for us is inquiry. When we go about history education. And the Library of Congress, as everyone knows, is a treasure trove of places to search and look for and support inquiry with the perfect primary source combination, and also the right historical sort of investigation that you're asking. And so we put together all these wonderful people together to advance history education in a way that feels exciting, that's relevant, that's accurate, and is reflective of our student population in California, which is crazy and fun and multi-diverse in all the wonderful ways that it's possible. And we utilize resources from the Library of Congress, Smithsonian, and particularly because we're looking to have our students reflected in the storytelling of the narratives that we share and that we help them create. We utilize community organizations, local history museums, and cultural institutions by us as well. So it's a fun mix of combination of primary sources, teachers, and scholars.
Oh, thanks so much, Tuyen. As I think about the different projects that the Teaching with Primary Sources program is able to support, whether it is a project that focuses on developing curriculum materials for teachers, whether it's working in partnership with teachers on the development of those materials, whether it's developing or creating specific kinds of professional development opportunities, the variety is terrific. And these examples you guys are sharing do a marvelous job of demonstrating that diversity. So Bridget, how about you?
Great. So our primary source program is based in the education department of our university. We have also been with Teaching with Primary Sources since 2009. So the project has changed and shifted over the years, but central throughout all of that time has been professional development for underprivileged school systems in our area to bring them free professional development. And yes, next slide, please. But also using, since we are based in the education department, working with our pre-service and in-service teachers to create curricula together. And so our current project is titled Appalachia as a Macrocosm of the American Story, and it focuses on developing curricula that explores diversity within Appalachian culture. So we are working with 20 teachers, K-12 within our county, faculty members from both the education department and the history department of our university, and our pre-service social studies methods course to work on a vertically aligned curricula that can be shared out. And the goal of that curriculum is two-part. One, to explore, as I've said a few times now, the diversity within Appalachian culture, but secondly, and to make connections for students with events that are happening very close to home and that have happened close to home to larger national issues. In our space, many of our schools still are serve a high population of impoverished students. And so the experiences that our local students have to travel beyond Western North Carolina are very limited. And so one of the things that is just powerful and empowering for them is to introduce them to the world beyond their immediate space through primary sources, through virtual field trips, through the news stories that are happening past and present, and to have students begin thinking from very early age. Our curriculum is beginning with kindergarten students, but going ahead and beginning to think about what is culture, which is a big question to answer. That word is hard to define. What is culture? How do I understand my own culture and what's happening around me and why I am who I am? And then how does that connect to cultures beyond myself that I may have not had the chance to interact with yet, but hopefully at some point I will? And using primary sources to introduce them to those cultures, to introduce them to the connection between their geographical space and the rest of the United States, and introduce them to some tools to help them ask questions and have conversations with people who are different than themselves. And we're in the first year of this particular project and are hoping to continue developing that curriculum, and in the third year be able to share that out beyond our local county, but with the surrounding counties within Western North Carolina.
Now, so many good examples, Bridget, and great description of what you all are doing. Allison, how about you?
Well, I realized at the beginning, part of our project, the Collaborative for Educational Services, which is an educational service agency that supports schools supporting students. Our motto is everyone is a learner, and we really care about access. And one thing I should do is to explain where I am. Could you go back to me for just a second? I just want to say that everyone else gave a great description of what you would see on the screen, which is that I am a woman with light-colored hair and a pair of glasses, a white woman in a red dress, in a room with dark wood paneling and some pictures and on the walls and books. But then we can go back to the screen about our program within the Collaborative for Educational Services, which is Accessing Inquiry. And our agency as a whole really cares about student voice and helping teachers learn to remove barriers that keep some students from being able to access all the features of curriculum. So Emerging America within the collaborative focuses on resources for teachers in history, social studies, and the humanities. Many other training for access focuses on math, science, and English. And we found that teachers who teach students with disabilities, teachers who teach multilingual learners find fewer resources to help students engage primary sources, historic materials that may contain difficult text and presume a lot of background knowledge. We have a website that we work on at emergingamerica.org. And within that, we have a project called Accessing Inquiry, where we provide teaching strategies that anyone can access with lesson plans, teaching techniques, primary source sets, online exhibits, and lessons that have been created by teachers who participated in workshops from around the country that they created for their own classes that we made available to you. We focus particularly on resources, as I mentioned, for teaching multilingual learners using primary sources on immigrant history. And I want to highlight our collaboration with a new grantee of the Library of Congress, the Massachusetts Council for the Social Studies, and they answered the call of the library to put in a application for a grant to reach new users of the Library of Congress, and I think and they got funding as a new member, and I think Leanne will tell you all a little bit more about how that might be possible for teachers and organizations and unusual educational settings around the country. We are working in out-of-school settings and voter education projects in the future, as well as in traditional classrooms. I want to tell you about an exciting project that we're working on at the Collaborative with the Library of Congress funding we receive, developing a disability history K through 12 curriculum. traditionally, disability history tends to get taught at the university level, but so many kids in classrooms are students who might have an individualized educational plan, an IEP or a 504 plan, which connects to very groundbreaking legislation in American history for inclusion, but they don't see themselves in the history that they're learning. And so we are working on creating, with a library support, a curriculum that will have groups of lessons for every level from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's going to be called From Reform to Equal Rights. It will start becoming available in January or February. And on emergingamerica.org, you can get links to the curriculum as we produce it, as well as to recordings of professional development events and upcoming events, both in the past and the future. So we're really excited about the work that the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian and other institutions have enabled us to do, and really welcome your questions if there are aspects of this that have piqued your interest that we don't talk about today.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, so here's we've sort of, this next question we've sort of answered already, but I want to give a little context to it. And that is that the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian and other cultural institutions really started digitizing their collections in the late 1990s. And today, the amount of material that is available online is sort of mind-blowing. And so it's so interesting that we're having this conversation today, because just a couple of decades ago, we couldn't have had this conversation because these materials weren't available the way they are available today. And so my question for all of you is, so why are primary sources and these primary source combinations important to the work that you're doing? It's kind of obvious, but jump right in there, Jessica.
So when we're talking about culturally relevant pedagogy and the individual experiences of kids, not every collection can be everything to every kid or every teacher. And so we need to expand our primary source collections and what we use. And so a great example that I was just inspired by Allison sharing her work is that because of this TPS program with the library, I've been able to learn from Allison and her colleague Rich, so that a couple of years ago when I was doing a workshop for Minneapolis elementary teachers, I made sure that I looked in the Minnesota Historical Society collections for images of children with disabilities, and actually found a series of photographs of children from a Minneapolis elementary school that was specifically opened for children with disabilities. And so I learned from my colleagues and continue to learn because we want all students to see themselves. And so therefore we have to make these combinations so that they can, like Bridget said, learn about their own culture, but then what cultures do I not know about yet and how can I learn? So that's why we at the Minnesota Historical Society in our project make sure that we are always looking for, oh, we've got this, but what about this?
Marvelous. Tuyen, how about you? Why are primary source combinations, materials from different collections and repositories, important to the work that you're doing?
Earlier, I used the word fun a lot when I was describing our project. And when I say fun, I think of myself as a learner who desperately needed primary sources when I was growing up, primary sources that reflect me, that I could see my voice and my perspective, who could visually look like me, was exciting. And so the fun to me is demystifying this understanding of like how we create narratives, the different perspectives that are out there, the visual understanding and the audio, and the variety of mediums that students can be exposed to and learn from, with an attention to accessibility, as Allison talks about, and also the culturally relevant pedagogy that Jessica is speaking to. And then also just like this idea of like that culture is very specific to a place, as Bridget was talking about, primary sources do so much and inspire so much. And for me, I like a combination because I think it's really important. The historian part of me thinks it's really important to corroborate what it is, the storytelling that we are presenting. And so we want to ask, like, how do we know this is true? How, what other perspective are we missing here? How does this does this still resonate if I introduce this other point of view? And, you know, what is it about the story that I didn't know before? And, you know, like the criticality of just education in general is like, why am I hearing this for the first time? So all those things, I think, make it possible, those questions to be answered in historical investigations through a variety of primary sources.
No, it's great. You guys know me well enough to know I'm a Post-it note person and I'm taking notes. But so far, you guys have talked about how primary sources allow you to introduce different perspectives. And you've talked, without actually saying the words learning styles, you've definitely been talking about addressing different learning styles of students. You've also talked about the importance of making content relevant, again, so that kids see themselves. And just now, the focus on the importance and the value of multiple sources of information so that we can teach kids strategies for validating information and for detecting bias and those real skills that matter a great deal when it comes to information literacy. And Bridget, I bet you have something to say about that.
There's so many answers to this question. But that's what makes it such a great conversation to have today. But as everyone's talking, I'm like, where do I go next? But I think for me, this phrase of primary sources being an entry point is so important. And as a classroom teacher, making every student feel like they have something to contribute. So it's not even just the primary sources themselves, but that inquiry process of observing, reflecting, and questioning that provides each student a way to become engaged with the conversation. And that's one of the things I love about primary source instruction is that when I put a variety of sources out there, and as Allison, I think, said earlier, the students can choose and select something that speaks to them as a place to begin asking those questions. Every student in the classroom has a space to participate, and that is so empowering for the classroom environment, not just the individual student, but for the classroom environment that teachers are trying to create, so that powerful conversations can happen after that. So that would be my first piece. And then the other piece that I'm going to add, which has been said, but I want to explicitly state it again, is that I feel like the primary source set combination helps students explore the past in a really tangible, authentic way. So it's not just this story that's being told, but here are the artifacts from that time in history, and it makes history come alive. As cliche as that might sound, it really makes history come alive for students so they can explore the past to make those inferences and connections to why current situations may be happening in the way that they are, so they can kind of trace that narrative from the past to the present.
Very, very well said. I appreciate what you're saying about how materials in a variety of media, primary sources, allow our students to construct knowledge. I mean, that's what they help do. Beautifully put. And Allison, you want to chime in?
Sure. I love how Bridget connected not just what individual students learn, but the environment that a teacher is working to create of a class, and the class culture, the class feeling of excitement, of trust, of connection. I wonder whether somebody can find for me the slide with brains on it. I want to talk about why primary source combinations in a particular way from the lens of universal design for learning, which takes the concept of universal design in the environment, which allows there to be on-ramps and ways of removing barriers and adding access to buildings, particularly for some people, but we find that when you add those features to buildings, all people find themselves able to get in, and unexpected access develops for people with strollers, people with luggage, people with beautiful, enormous bass violins. And so I'd love it if you could find that slide with a brains, and I'm going to talk about CAST, which is an organization that looked at brain science to look at what happens when you represent things for people, what part in their mind, what in their brain, in a brain scan, lights up. Different forms of representation will light up parts of a brain. Different forms of participation and inviting students to get engaged, to connect to their real life, will light up a different part of the brain. And different forms of getting involved, asking questions, taking action, moving things around, sorting those primary source images into collections that are grouped by a logic that makes sense to the student, that will light up yet another part of the brain. So having a collection of primary sources is really consistent with brain science about learning and about engaging all learners. And so a combination of primary sources that lets you have representation and engagement and action, all forms of the universal design for learning model, is another reason to use a primary source combination.
Sorry, I did just send a note to Khalid. I think it's slide number 21. Khalid, if you can go ahead and pull that one up to reference what Allison was referring to, that would be great. We're still just seeing it. There we go. All right, Allison, you want to speak to it just a little bit more? Are you pretty good now?
I think probably people followed along, but on the left is engagement, and you can see that that core area in the middle, and it's actually on the left. I spoke about it in a different order, and engagement is really the first one, the most central one, the one that gets all the other senses going. So the ways you engage your students are varied. You know your students, but the multiple ways of representing and the action and expression, you can see all of those are different portions of the brain. And if you can get all those portions of the brain to light up, you've got your students.
No, that's beautiful. That's exactly right. And it's great that you've all spoken to just the different powers of primary sources and the fact that they all do connect and ultimately contribute to how we learn and how our students learn. Very well described, all of you. Okay, we're going to move on in our conversation. And I'm also cognizant of time and aware that we have roughly 25 minutes left, and we do want to allow a little time for some questions from participants. But before we do that, I want each of you to talk just a little bit about what you're seeing as far as impact in your programs. How do you know that what you're doing is working? So Jessica, what's going on?
Oh my goodness. I told Leanne to cut me off if I talk too much because I'm so excited about this story. So there is an elementary school in South Minneapolis called Hale. And the teacher, Megan Peterson, came to a program of mine through the Library of Congress a number of years ago. And she was so excited about using culturally relevant pedagogy and primary sources that she created that fall a program for her students. There is a historic fort nearby, historic Fort Snelling, and Minnesota Historical Society was in the middle of a public input process about the fort. So she found primary sources about the fort, talked about the fort and its history and indigenous residents with her first graders. Then they took a field trip to the fort. This was pre-COVID. And then they came back, and the first grade students participated in the public input process online because they had scaffolded knowledge about the fort, its history, its present, and they were able to contribute to this conversation. So this teacher then continued to create this program called Unearthing Histories, where she was building in primary sources about the community in which her first grade students lived. And there is a home in the neighborhood on the National Register where a Black family moved in the 1930s and white mobs surrounded the house, and the family, which had a kindergarten child living in the home, ended up moving after a year and a half because of the threats to the family. So they learned about the family. They learned about what it means to be welcoming and a neighbor. And then they took a walking field trip to the house, saw the house, and then came back and talked about what can we do in our community to be good neighbors. It's an incredible story. We wrote an article about it, but Megan has really taken this look at primary sources and the world of her students and said, what can I do to expand it? And it really shows that not only is it possible, but it's possible for our very youngest learners.
I love that story, Jessica. And I, so often we talk about the power of primary sources. And I think what I like the most about that story is that it really focuses on how primary sources can empower, right? I just love it. Yay. All right, Tuyen, impact.
Hey, so let me start by, I want to say that I want to be in Megan's classroom. I want to redo a first grade too. So I started out with the Asian American Pacific Islander biographies I was creating for a conference in which I was presenting at. And I have on my screen some bullet points that I'd like to read out in terms of impact, what folks got out of that session and also the entire conference. What are you most excited? The question was, what are you most excited to share with your community from today? Someone said, trying to integrate the Smithsonian Institute, hey, resources for building background in my API-centered units, primary sources on Asian American experiences. And this is my favorite. The 64-year-old me would tell my 10-year-old me that there is representation now. And I love that because this is what I feel as well. And it doesn't get better than that, making sure that our students feel seen and heard and valued and that they belong.
No, I love that. That notion of, I think we all wonder sometimes if we're making progress, and the ability that looking at primary sources from the past provide us to compare the then and the now. I like that quote an awful lot, Tuyen. Very nice. All right, Bridget, impact in your community with your project.
Sure. So I'm going to just repeat a minute. Primary sources allow authentic conversations and inquiry to occur with students of all ages. And that is what I think speaks to me the most, because I started as a high school ELA teacher. And then when I began directing the primary source program and moved to the professorship here at Mars Hill, we're an elementary school program. And so seeing this K-12 progression and how they can reach all students is just really important to me. Because it allows teachers to meet students where they are and activate background knowledge on any topic. So I also just have two quotes from different age level of teachers to share with you guys. The first is from an 11th grade history teacher in our local community. She says, all kids like music and all kids have an opinion about music. So using music to help students consider the cultural diversity of our region has been a great entry point into tough discussions about the history of Appalachia in my class. And then the second quote is from an elementary school music teacher. She says, I'm an elementary music teacher, and many people don't see why that is an important job. But when I introduced the various styles of music that melded together to create Appalachian mountain music, my students can discuss culture in a way that makes sense to them and goes beyond their individual family customs. So I will leave it there because I just think those quotes are very powerful from two different age levels of students and two totally different content areas, just to show the range of reach that primary sources provide.
No, they're great quotes, Bridget. My colleagues and I at the library often talk about how primary sources were not created with a particular grade level in mind, nor were they created with a particular subject matter in a classroom in mind. And their ability to serve as teaching tools is just tremendous, really, across the grade spectrum and across the curriculum. And those quotes really speak to that. So I love them. Allison, impact. And you've got a couple of slides for this.
I do. I love that what we've been talking about. We've looked at a classroom and a story, a compelling story about how this first grade classroom learned something so powerful. We've looked at how teachers respond to and can characterize their work. And I'm going to talk about the impact in the voice of a student. So if you take a look at my slide, this student, young adult, with disabilities was vetting our early drafts of the K through 12 disability curriculum, and their response was, "Why didn't my school teach me this?" So in this case, we had a young disability advocate looked at this photo of a man, a little man with a disability, contributing to the war effort during World War II, and learning that people with disabilities were really very important in the United States response to gearing up for war and supplying soldiers at the front, made a real difference to this student and to many students who can see themselves in curriculum that might not be in our textbooks, but if we can find the primary sources that meet our students in our classrooms, we can make our textbooks fit them. And if we take a look quickly at the next slide, I just wanted to say that the impact of primary sources is to increase accessibility, and that with a collection using several sources, and I will echo Tuyen that by using poems and stories and fiction as sources that balance with historical photos, we do include representation and the telling of the stories and thinking about who tells the story in that collection. So while we're talking about primary sources, we are not excluding the value of other contributions to really taking perspective and telling the stories we want to. So with that, the impact of access, I think, is in all of the stories that we've just heard. And I'll pass it back to Leanne.
Thanks, Allison. Again, great examples of impact. And I have to say that really on behalf of the library, I am just thrilled that the library gets a chance to play a role in all of these projects, through the grant money, certainly, but also through the collections and through the collaboration. And, I love that. I love that all of you know each other, and I love that all of you work together on your projects, and that you work with many other partners as you are serving educators and students. And I mentioned this at the beginning of our session, that there really are dozens, actually there are hundreds of organizations across the country that have participated in the library's Teaching with Primary Sources program since it began in 2006. And all of those organizations are part of the TPS consortium. And what they have in common is that at some point they either received grant funding from the library or they were utilizing the library's collections to serve teachers and students. And so I tell you what, pull up that next slide, because I want to tell you a little bit more about the consortium and then open it up for questions. So the slide right before this one, just so you all can see, there's a link there. If you are interested in learning more about the Teaching with Primary Sources program and or different TPS programs that might be happening in your community, that link, the loc.gov/program/teachers, on the left-hand side of that page, there's a link to the Teaching with Primary Sources grant program, where you can learn about the organizations. There's a little interactive map that looks like the one you see there. And there's information about how to apply for a grant and the different kinds of grant opportunities that exist, whether through the library specifically or through one of our regional partners. We have a partner in the East, in the Midwest, and in the West that make available grants to organizations, again, to develop curriculum using primary sources from the library's digitized collections, and or to develop professional development opportunities for educators and for community members. The next slide. I mentioned at the beginning how many of our partners chimed in and told us about their interest in the conversation we were having about using collections from different repositories, different cultural institutions. And I've just listed a few of them here. different organizations across the country that are using collections in powerful ways with teachers and with students. And with that, I think we are ready to go to questions. And I think we've got about 12 whole minutes for them. And I tell you what, I think it's probably best if, Camille, if you want to talk to us, you are welcome to, if questions come in, or if you want to type them into the chat for us, that would be fine too. Either way. Okay, Laura says, a perfect primary source collection engages the senses and sparks questions. Beautiful. My biggest challenge when using primary source collections or combinations is geared toward older students. It's a skill that even kindergartners can practice, and finding materials in K-5 is hard. Okay, so panelists, and maybe I'll start with Bridget, because I know that your focus is very much, and then maybe Jessica, I know you've got some thoughts here too, but finding materials for K-5 students, what are some of your strategies, some of your suggestions?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I think beginning with the images allows students of all ages access, because all students can say what they see, and if they can't write those things, they can tell you. Or I love to print the images and just have students start circling things and giving them some prompting questions. So, what people do you see? What are some objects that tell us something about the setting, to help reinforce some of those other standards that they have to think about too with their ELA standards. So I think starting with the images is a really good place to start with young learners. And I'm also going to come back to those tangible objects and the music. All age groups love music. Now, I think the challenge that sometimes teachers make, myself included, bigger than maybe what it is this age appropriate? Part of that is how you frame the conversation around the image or the primary source that you are using, and using scaffolding questions for those young learners to help them learn how to think through a primary source and help them make that link between the source and their standards. And I'm going to pass to Jessica, because that connection with the neighbors and the being a good neighbor in the neighborhood was like the perfect example of how to do that.
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, I'm going to echo everything Bridget said and add that if you can find primary sources that show children, that immediately connects to them. And so on our website, mnhs.org/IUM, we have a number of primary source sets directed toward K-5 students. One is called Kids in School, because all the kids that we're talking to are in school, so they have that common experience. Another one is School Gardens, and where they can see children working in school gardens. And so if you have the resources to print out those images, sometimes what we'll do is give a student a source and do just what Bridget said, circle, make comments, and then they stand up and they go find someone else with a different primary source and find similarities and differences between their sources, just to begin to build those historical thinking skills.
No, I love it. And Laura, I wanted to alert you to the Library of Congress has a blog specifically for teachers, and it's called the Teaching with the Library of Congress blog. And a number of years ago, we had a teacher in residence working with us, Teresa from New Jersey, and she wrote a series of blog posts under the title Kindergarten Historians. And each one of those posts focused on strategies for working with and identifying primary sources that are effective with the youngest of our students. And I think some of those posts might be of real interest to you, but great. All right, next question from Lisa. This is so cool. You're gonna love this, Jessica. So Lisa says, Megan is a rock star. How can we support all teachers who might not have the time or access to field trips to create that exact learning experience?
Megan
Yes.
is, in fact, a rock star. But I think what we can pull from Megan's experience is that no matter what community you live in, there is something that is historically based because the present is built upon the past. So what is the name of the school? What is the name of the street? What is the name of the county? Or are there memorials or monuments in the town? Are there cemeteries? How can you take what is in your community and perhaps if you can't do a field trip, pull up the names of things and dig into why is that named that particular thing? So I would say that whatever community you live in, you can reflect it with primary sources. Those Sanborn maps that I mentioned are really useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add to that too, if you can't go to the place, bringing people to you. So finding the historians in your community that are willing to come talk with your students, or having your students do the interviews with elderly individuals that they already know and have relationships with, to think about the past and what has changed about their community, creates a similar experience if you're not able to take the field trip with the students.
That is such a great suggestion, Bridget. And also, if the students have an opportunity to interview those community members, and maybe we can provide them with an additional skill set, collecting oral histories. I know that my colleagues in the American Folklife Center would love to hear more about that. I've got another question, and it sort of piggybacks on this and what Jessica's story related to Megan and her first graders. The question is related to curriculum challenges. Have any of you had to deal with laws or parent groups trying to limit these diverse curricula? Sadly, where I live, I could see issues with the first graders learning about the maltreatment of the Black family. So again, the question, if any of you had to deal with groups, with laws or with parent groups trying to limit the diverse curricula.
I'll jump in here. A couple of things. I serve on my local school board, and so this is something that we have encountered, in particular about books that some groups don't want in our schools. With Megan's situation, she made sure that she was in contact with the families from the very beginning and said, this is what we are going to be talking about. And she built these relationships with the families so that she could have conversations. And she said that because of that scaffolding, she only had a few instances where she had to have additional conversations with families. And I would say that when we encounter these types of challenges, I lean back on the idea that history is not just one story, but a multitude of stories. And we want each of our kids to see themselves and their families represented. And history is complex and not always pretty, but that is the story of human beings. And so I know that it's really difficult out there right now for educators. And so I would say lean on the sources. If you're talking about the reason for the Civil War beginning, pull out the secession documents, lean on the sources as much as possible. But I'd love to hear what my colleagues say.
I'll chime in. I think Massachusetts has a reputation for being a blue state, but I live in a rural part of a blue state, and there are certainly teachers everywhere who are concerned about either the anxiousness of their leadership in the school, or particular families who are concerned that their children receive education consistent with their views. And I think I'm going to echo the response that is to both look to the standards of your state. In the state standards, there's an expectation in every state that you teach the events of United States history as they occur. And even in some of the most extreme new looks at how history should be taught, there isn't actually a lot of reversal of that. There's just a presentation that The presentation of those events should not be unduly biased, but they have not gone so far as to say, don't teach what happened. And so again, using primary sources removes a great deal of the risk that teacher opinion is going to be the question. So if you're teaching kids to look at historical documents, try to find out what people were saying and what other people were saying about what people were saying, whether it's in photographs or documentation or letters, and trying to get a range of those so that we see at the time how things were looked at. That's a really safe, grounded space to be, that principals, school leaders, school boards can get behind, that students learning to look at historical documents and see how they were understood at the time, and how we might how students, the other advice that's given is let students draw the conclusions. Create good classroom culture where we understand we don't call each other names. We don't use all the words that we find in historical documents about naming groups. Those are historical words that may be offensive in modern day, but we do let the students ask the questions and let there be student-led inquiry rather than teacher-leading questions. And the more that we can, what do you notice is different, is a very supportive question for all parents. And what students notice is what they're bringing and what they're gaining in the classroom.
Thanks, you guys. Okay, I'm looking at the clock and we are losing time fast. So 2 important things. There's a question about where we can find out more about sources and collections. And of course, if you go to the library's website and you're on our teachers page, there are lots of links to professional development opportunities. And if you go to all of our various TPS partners, many partners make available opportunities as well. All of the slides and the links from this session will be available as part of this program. So once you've logged in, you have access. And I can't thank my colleagues enough. So big shout out to Bridget and to Allison and to Jessica and to Tuyen, and again to all of our other TPS colleagues who showed interest in this session, and to all of the participants. Thank you all for spending today with us, and we wish you all the very best. Thank you.